The trauma bay doors slammed open at 3:47 in the morning, and Elena Marsh felt her whole body go still before her mind caught up. 6 years of night shifts had taught her to read chaos in half a second. But this was different. The gurney that came through was surrounded by men in tactical gear. Blood soaked into fabric that wasn't supposed to be there. Radios crackling with call signs instead of hospital codes. The patient on the gurney was barely conscious. His arm shredded from wrist to elbow. Shrapnel still lodged somewhere beneath torn muscle. And he was mumbling words that made every nurse in the room freeze. Not screams. Not curses. A string of numbers and letters, clipped and precise. The kind of thing you'd only recognize if you'd heard it before, whispered into a radio in the dead of night by a man who never made it home. Elena's hands didn't shake, but something behind her ribs cracked open like a door she'd nailed shut 3 years ago. She stepped forward before anyone called her name, because her body remembered this rhythm even if her mind was screaming to run the other way. Dr. Preston Vale, the trauma surgeon everyone deferred to, was already barking orders, but his voice carried the particular impatience he reserved for chaos he didn't control. Get me 2 units O-neg, somebody page ortho, and somebody get this soldier's chart before I lose him on the table. He glanced at Elena only long enough to bark her name like a tool he expected to function. Marsh, pressure and line now. She moved without needing to be told twice, but her eyes kept dropping to the patient's lips, watching the shape of the words he kept repeating, a sequence that meant nothing to Preston and everything to her. Bravo 6 requesting exfil, hostiles at the perimeter. It was almost identical to the last transmission her husband Daniel had sent before his unit went dark in a canyon nobody back home ever got the full story about. She swallowed hard and focused on the 4 line, but her fingers found the vein like they already knew this man's blood pressure would crash in the next 90 seconds. And it did. BP's dropping, 60/40, she called out, and Preston cursed under his breath, ordering more fluids, more hands, more noise. The room filled with the particular controlled panic of a trauma bay working against a clock nobody could see. Monitors screaming their alarms, a resident fumbling with a central line kit, someone shouting for a second unit of blood. But underneath the noise, Elena heard something nobody else in that room was equipped to hear. The patient's mumbling shifted, the numbers changing, and she recognized the pattern instantly. A distress code buried inside what looked like delirium. The same kind of layered communication Daniel used to explain to her late at night when he couldn't sleep. Back when operational security meant he could never tell her exactly what he did, only that sometimes soldiers hid messages inside noise so that if the wrong ears were listening, they'd hear nothing but a wounded man rambling. She leaned close to his ear, ignoring the surgeon's sharp look, and said quietly, "Copperhead is compromised." "Say again." "Copperhead is compromised." The soldier's eyes snapped open for one raw, terrified second, and he grabbed her wrist with a grip that shouldn't have been possible for a man losing this much blood. "How do you know that call sign?" he rasped, and the room went quiet enough that the monitors sounded like gunfire. Preston stepped in immediately, pulling rank the way administrators do when they sense a story slipping outside their control. "Marsh, step back. You're not authorized to interact with this patient beyond your clinical role." He said it loud enough for the residents to hear, loud enough to make sure everyone understood the hierarchy in this room. Nurse beneath surgeon, civilian beneath soldier, background beneath spotlight. Elena stepped back exactly 1 pace, hands still steady, jaw tight enough to ache. She didn't argue. She never argued in front of a patient. But something in her chest had reignited. A fire she'd spent 3 years trying to bury under 12-hour shifts and quiet apartments, and a folded flag she kept in a drawer she rarely opened. She caught her own reflection in the dark window behind the monitors, and for a moment she barely recognized the woman staring back, someone who looked like she'd just remembered exactly who she used to be married to. If this story is pulling you in already, make sure you're subscribed to The Hidden Nurse, because what Elena carries inside her is bigger than anyone in that hospital understands, and you do not want to miss where this goes. They wheeled him into surgery within minutes, and Elena was pulled onto other patients, other charts, other emergencies that didn't pause for her personal history to catch its breath. But her mind stayed with the soldier on that table the entire shift, replaying his voice, replaying the exact cadence of those numbers, a cadence she hadn't heard spoken aloud since the last phone call she ever had with Daniel 3 days before his unit disappeared into radio silence for good. She remembered sitting on their kitchen floor at 2 in the morning back then, notebook in hand, as he taught her the shape of his world without ever revealing its secrets, laughing when she got a sequence wrong, patient when she asked him to repeat it, promising her it was just in case, just a precaution, nothing she'd ever actually need. She had believed him. She had wanted to believe him, and she had spent 3 years since telling herself that belief had been foolish, until tonight, when a stranger's blood pressure crashed on a gurney and the code came back to her like it had never left. For the next 4 hours Elena worked the periphery of the soldier's care, drawing labs, checking dressings, saying nothing while Preston took credit for a save that had started the moment she recognized a code buried in delirious mumbling. She watched him tell the attending physician a clean, simplified version of events, one where his surgical instincts alone had stabilized a critical patient, no mention of the nurse who'd caught the compromised distress signal before anyone else in the room understood what they were even hearing. She didn't correct him. She'd learned long ago that some battles weren't worth fighting in the moment, that patience carried its own kind of power, the same patience Daniel had once told her was the most underrated weapon in any operator's arsenal. But codes didn't fade from memory just because a shift ended, and neither did the quiet certainty settling into her chest that this collision with the soldier's world was not an accident. When the soldier finally opened his eyes fully 2 days later, groggy and disoriented in a recovery bed, the machines around him beeping in a slower, steadier rhythm than the chaos of his arrival, the first face he searched for wasn't the surgeon who'd operated on him. It was hers. She happened to be adjusting his foredrip when his eyes focused, sharp despite the sedation fog clouding them. "You're the one who said Copperhead," he said, voice hoarse and cracked from the ventilator tube they'd only recently removed. "Who taught you that?" Elena hesitated at the door, weighing 3 years of careful silence against the look in the stranger's eyes, a look that told her he already suspected the truth before she said a word, like he was bracing himself for an answer that would change the shape of this hospital stay entirely. "My husband," she finally said, voice quiet but steady. "He used to run comms for a team just like yours. Before he didn't come home." The soldier's face changed, recognition dawning slow and heavy, like a door opening onto a room he didn't expect to find, his eyes tracing her features now like he was searching for confirmation of something impossible. "Daniel Marsh," he said, not a question. "You're Daniel Marsh's wife." The way he said it, reverent and stunned, told Elena this wasn't a coincidence, and that the quiet life she'd built in this hospital, invisible and unremarkable by design, was about to collide with a past she thought she'd buried for good, a collision that would pull her out of the shadows whether she was ready for it or not. The soldier's name was Master Sergeant Cole Whitfield, and over the next 3 days, as his condition improved and his memory sharpened, he told Elena things about her husband that no folded flag or condolence letter had ever given her. Daniel hadn't just run comms. Cole explained in a voice still rough from intubation, propped up against pillows with his shredded arm wrapped in careful layers of gauze and splinting. Daniel had built the very code system that saved Cole's life in that trauma bay, a layered distress language designed so a wounded operator could communicate under duress or interrogation without an enemy understanding a word of it, hiding real information inside what sounded like meaningless, feverish rambling. Daniel had trained a handful of teams personally before his final deployment, sitting in windowless briefing rooms with whiteboards full of number sequences, and Cole had been one of those students, memorizing patterns he never imagined he'd need to speak through blood loss and shock on a hospital gurney years later, in a city Daniel never got to see again. Elena sat by his bed that afternoon, off the clock, hands wrapped around a lukewarm coffee, listening to a stranger describe her husband with more clarity and detail than she'd allowed herself to remember in years, every sentence peeling back a little more of the wall she'd built around his memory. "He saved my life twice," Cole said quietly, his eyes distant, like he was replaying the entire night in his mind. "Once when he taught me that code years ago in a room I can't even tell you the location of. And once 3 nights ago when apparently his training reached across time and found the one nurse in this hospital who'd actually know what I was saying." Elena felt her throat tighten, but she kept her composure, the same composure that had carried her through 4 hours of triage while a piece of her husband's legacy bled out on a table 20 feet away. She asked Cole questions she'd never had answers to, Small details. The sound of Daniel's voice in briefings. Whether he ever mentioned home. Whether the men under his instruction knew how much he missed her during those long stretches of silence. Cole answered every question with the kind of respect reserved for someone owed the truth. And by the time visiting hours ended, Elena walked out of that recovery room feeling like she'd recovered a piece of her husband she thought had been buried with him. Word traveled fast in a hospital, faster than any policy could contain it, and by the following morning, Dr. Preston Vale had heard enough fragments of the story to feel threatened by it. He found Elena in the supply room restocking for kits and closed the door behind him. Arms crossed, voice pitched low but sharp, the kind of tone administrators use when they sense their authority slipping. I don't know what kind of story you're building with Sergeant Whitfield, but I need you to remember your role here. You're a floor nurse, Marsh, not a case study, and I won't have you turning my trauma bay into a recruitment video for whatever this is. Elena set down the box of supplies with deliberate calm, the kind of calm she'd learned from years of holding steady while everyone around her panicked. I'm not building a story, Dr. Vale. I identified a compromised distress code that saved his life before you ever touched a scalpel. If that's a problem for you, it's a problem you should sit with, not me. Preston's jaw tightened, and used to being challenged by someone he'd spent years treating as background noise. Competent but invisible, useful but unremarkable. He left without another word, but the tension in the hallway outside told Elena this wasn't over. If a story like this moves you, hit subscribe right now, because The Hidden Nurse brings you these true-to-life tributes to the quiet heroes hiding behind hospital scrubs, and Elena's story is far from over. 3 days later, Cole was well enough for visitors, and the visitor who arrived changed everything. Rear Admiral Frank Denning walked into the recovery ward in dress uniform, flanked by 2 aides, and the entire floor seemed to straighten its spine in his presence. Nurses pausing mid-stride, residents suddenly aware of how they were standing. He wasn't there for a courtesy call. He was there because Cole Whitfield had filed a report the moment he was lucid enough to speak, detailing exactly how he'd survived, and that report had a name in it that made senior command sit up and take notice. Denning found Elena at the nurse's station, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man who didn't waste words on people who hadn't earned them. Mrs. Marsh, I served 2 deployments alongside your husband's unit. I want you to know that the code Sergeant Whitfield used, the one you recognized in that trauma bay, is still classified, still in active use, and still saving lives because your husband refused to let his knowledge die with him. He trained instructors. Those instructors trained others. What you did 3 nights ago wasn't luck. It was Daniel's legacy reaching through you. Elena's throat tightened, and for the first time in years, she let herself cry in front of colleagues without shame, without apologizing for the emotion, because grief finally felt like it had somewhere honest to land instead of a wound she carried alone. Preston watched the exchange from across the ward, and something in his posture shifted, the arrogance draining slowly into something closer to shame. He approached later that day, alone, without the sharpness he usually carried like armor, hands shoved into his coat pockets like a man unsure what to do with them. I owe you an apology, he said, and the words looked like they cost him something to say, each syllable dragged out reluctantly. I saw a nurse overstepping her role. I didn't see a woman who understood something about that trauma none of the rest of us could. I was wrong, and I'm sorry. Elena accepted it with the same steadiness she brought to everything, no bitterness, no triumph, just quiet acknowledgement. The kind of grace that made Preston feel smaller than any argument could have. 2 weeks later, in a small ceremony held in the hospital's front courtyard, Admiral Denning presented Elena with a distinguished commendation on behalf of her late husband's unit, recognizing both Daniel's contribution to operational medicine and Elena's role in carrying his legacy forward into a moment that mattered. Cole stood beside her in his dress uniform, arms still healing beneath the fabric, and saluted her the way he would any officer who'd earned it, a gesture that told the entire hospital staff gathered around them exactly who Elena Marsh really was, a woman who had spent 3 years grieving quietly while carrying something far greater than anyone around her ever suspected. That evening, walking to her car under a sky just beginning to darken into deep amber and violet, Elena felt lighter than she had in 3 years, not because the grief was gone, but because it finally had a purpose, a place to rest instead of a wound to hide. Daniel hadn't just left her memories. He'd left a whisper that traveled through time, through code, through the body of a stranger who needed saving, and found her exactly when it mattered most. She realized then that being underestimated had never been her weakness. It had been the quiet armor that let her carry his legacy without anyone seeing it coming, until the moment it changed everything, and she finally let herself believe that some part of Daniel was still out there, still protecting the people he trained, still finding his way home one saved life at a time.